Welcome back, Mike. Delighted you could rejoin us for the second part of your fascinating insights into the world of spies and the parallels with the world of sales. For those people that missed last week's episode, we were talking to Mike Mears, who obviously was a senior person in the CIA, about the parallels between leadership in the CIA and in other leadership positions and sales. So without further ado, we'll let Mike get into more about sales and spying. My name's Mike Lander, and you're listening to Higgle, the B2B Sales Club podcast, where we bring you actionable insights about sales RFPs, negotiations, and difficult procurement discussions from sales leaders, brand leaders, and procurement leaders. Please subscribe to get updates when new episodes are released. So let's move on to the whole how this relates to sales as part 2. But first, let's just touch on when you worked with Jack Welch, who was, in my book, an unbelievable leader, a very successful leader. What did you learn from working in and around Jack Welch about leadership and about getting people to do the right thing and to feel positive and to feel like they're making a difference?
I'll give you 3 quick stories. You know, his style, I don't think his style would apply today. I just was with a guy that worked for GE for 20 years this morning, and we're talking about how you're cutting out the bottom 10%. There's a lot of fear. There was a lot of fear when I worked there for my 9 years. Not a lot, but there was some. But I'll tell you, he did so many things right. Now, here's one where it's extremely difficult for a CEO to be able to communicate with people, because if you broadcast, if you tell them, they won't listen. This is one of the basics. I had a CIA director once, we were walking down the hall and he said, "Mike, why aren't they being more innovative?" And I knew he was talking about the employees because that was his big, but then he paused and then he said, "I've told them in my first 5 speeches I wanted more creativity." So how do you answer a CIA director asking a question like this? It's both naive and brilliant at the same time, right? So if you talk from the top, you're not going to get your message across, one-way transmissions. But what Welch would do, I remember this, he would fly into Crotonville, which is a GE training center, and we'd pull all the classes together in this one mammoth amphitheater-like room. And Welch would go in there and he would talk for 5 minutes on what was most important. Not an hour. He's not lecturing. It's just 5 minutes of what's really important. And people are alert that first 5 minutes. And then he would ask somebody a question and he would start a dialogue. And he would go on some of these things up to 4 hours, just discussion. And one time I walked back with him to a helicopter and he turned to me and said, "Mike, you know, it's amazing. I learned more about GE in my hour or 2 here than I do back at the headquarters in a month." And that's something. So it's that give and take. The other thing I want to go back to is something you brought earlier is you get involving the customer into this decision-making process. There was a apocryphal story at GE. I don't know if it's true or not, but it was Jack Welch was with his retiring union chief. Back in the day, those were pretty abrupt collisions that could occur between union and management. But it all went really well until right at the end, the union chief stood up and he really gave an impassioned talk. And he talked about how much GE meant to him, how GE was able to pay. He was able to pay to get his kids through college so they wouldn't have to be blue-collar workers. And he talked about the caliber of the employees, people he worked with. He loved that. But then right at the end, he looked at Welch and he said, "Mr. Welch, see these hands? You had use of these hands for 34 years. He said, if only you'd asked, you could have had my brain too." So I think, I mean, if that's true or not, it doesn't matter. It's a great story. But I think that's why he launched something called Workout, which is, I call quick wins, which is just you pull groups together, get the boss out of the room and let them debate on issues, rank them, and just report out to the boss when the boss comes back. It's a great way to get around some of these little cognitive biases that we have. And then he copied Six Sigma from Larry Bossidy at Allied. And what that involves is you've got to get the employees involved in the process improvement for 2 reasons. One, they know the process better. And number 2, they're bought in to the solution, right? So I'm convinced it's right back to what you were talking about, that was a big lesson I carried from him is, for goodness sakes, let go of your ego and get the other person involved. And
stop making assumptions.
Oh, yeah.
And it definitely applies in sales. You know, with sales teams, we make assumptions all the time. about why someone appears to be the best performer, why someone is behind quota, why they appear to be not working hard enough, or why they're not closing quickly enough, or we make all sorts of assumptions. And I think the important thing is for any sales leader is to stop making the assumption, because it's a shortcut, it's an assumption, and to go and ask and have a discussion. Doesn't mean being soft, means just having a discussion, finding out what's really going on.
Some of this stuff's hardwired, sort of hardwired traits. Like I have a tough time even though I did recruiting well, that's probably more of an indicator of my low empathy level rather. But I have a hard time with sales. Like I could not pick up the phone and make a cold call. So I think some of this is, certainly you have attributes or traits that help you in the sales field. But I think some of this can be learned, and what you were just talking about, where you can learn to ask more questions, you can learn to put brakes on yourself to keep a discussion going and to pull out more information. And gets into something, you had said this before the session, but we were talking about the curious salesperson. Yeah.
So let's come back to that in a second. Let's come back to curiosity, because I want to just go back to something that you mentioned in the kind of the first half, which was about safety, trust, clarity, and challenge. In a sales situation, I think this is quite fundamental. Just talk to me about how a salesperson might start to do that with a customer. Because ultimately, there was a book called The Challenger Sale many, many years ago by Matt Dixon and Brent Adamson, a very famous book in sales. It was called The Challenger Sale, to challenge a client. But of course, in order to challenge someone, as you say, you have to go through safety, trust, clarity, and then challenge. Talk to me about how you would think. You're not in sales, Mike, but think about the parallel world. How might a salesperson do that with a prospect? And why is it important to go through those 4 different layers? What did you find about creating safety first, then you build trust, then clarity before you challenge? Why was that so important?
On one level, when I was working with this best boss stuff and trying to cluster these things into that, there's kind of this natural flow that obviously somebody's not going to trust you if they don't feel safe with you. And it's really hard to have a meeting of the minds and clarity if they don't both trust you and feel safe. So there's this logical progression, I think, to this. And, again, I probably feel more empathy or sorrow, I suppose, for people that have very short sales cycles in some way that they don't get to really meet and, quote, develop that customer. To me, that makes it harder.
But if you've got time, if you've got like 6 months to close this deal, how do you, even just some basic things, Mike, how do you build safety? How do you build trust? What is clarity?
Even before that, let me just go and say there's a golden rule for leadership, sales, and recruiting agents, which is first do no harm. And I flew out, I heard about an experiment out at UCLA, and as soon as I heard about this, it's called social pain. And it's just a fancy word neuroscientists have for extreme emotional pain, okay? And as soon as I heard about this, I said, I got to go see this. So I flew out there and met with Matthew Lieberman, who was the doctor doing this. And what they did is they had people inside an MRI machine, and they're watching a little cartoon of 3 stick figures throwing a ball. And the subject in the MRI scan has got a lever. So every time they get the ball, they throw it to the other party, right? So Lieberman lets this little cartoon that they're looking at go for a couple minutes to let the brain settle. It's amazing how much the brain's working, even when it's doing nothing, communicating with different parts of the brain. And then he pushes a button unbeknownst to the subject, and the cartoon changes where these 2 figures start throwing the ball back and forth. And they've cut out the third party, you, the subject. And you look at what happens to the human brain. I wouldn't even tell you this if I hadn't really seen this. And it's anytime you inflict social pain inadvertently or on purpose, the brain of the other person, it goes absolutely haywire. And this happened to be a test on what happens when people feel something's unfair. So and things they looked at were like a sense of status. What if I said something inadvertently in a staff meeting and I insulted you and demeaned you in some way, as you perceive it, not as I perceive it? Or what if I do something unfair? Or what if I create uncertainty in your life? For example, I'm a CEO and say, hey, let's do a reorganization. You talking about social pain across the board on every autonomy, fairness, certainty, all that stuff just goes. So what happens, it's the amygdala flare up, But it's more than that. It's actually entire brain flares up. And this is what really shocked me was if you've inadvertently done that to someone, the memory of social pain is more intensely held than physical pain. So that's why, Mike, you remember that girl in high school that betrayed you.
You hold on
You
for it
still
for
remember
years.
it. But
Yeah,
you sprained your ankle playing soccer, and it's hard to retrieve that memory.
exactly.
So it's held in memory longer, and it is more intense. So for goodness sake, step one is for whatever you do, take a close look at your approach with the customer and everything you say to the customer, and just make sure you haven't crossed that line. And then try to get a little feedback as you're talking to the customer to find out, if you did hit a tripwire. So that's step one. And then on the psychological safety, it's just one, making sure you don't inflict social pain. And then number two, smiling, saying hello in the morning. I mean, this is really ABC stuff. But again, sometimes we forget in the rush of business, we'll jump right in. Even chit chat is crucial to the human brain. They've done marriage studies, on that, marital studies at the Gottman Institute. And then the safety thing is I would have anybody who's in sales make a list of what are the free currencies, free gifts that they can give to a client. Hints, tips, information that they can share about the industry, kudos for the company having done something. You make out a list and you're going to find you got like probably 30 to 35 items on the list. And that's going to be the key. Every time you meet that customer is make sure you're giving gifts. It's the consistency of your action to do that.
That triggers reciprocity in your prospect.
That's it. Absolutely. And then this law holds in psychology and it holds in anthropology both. So definitely works in sales. So, and even asking people about their interests. My wife points this out to me. Talk about, their background, or talk about their kids or any of that. That shows a legitimate interest that you have. And it's a way we kind of transmit our empathy levels to other people. And when you ask those type of questions, everything, it could be priorities in business or what worries you or personal life, things like that. Anytime you're open and asking those questions, it shows that you've got a level of concern and have some degree of having their best interest at heart. That's what we're looking for when we're dealing with other people.
If you look at trust, there was a very good piece of work done, I think in the 80s, 90s, by a guy called Meister, called the trust equation. And Meister and his colleagues worked out that trust equals credibility plus reliability plus professional intimacy, either professional relationship, divided by self-interest, i.e., the higher your self-interest is, the lower the trust becomes with your counterparty.
That's interesting.
Does that kind of resonate? And is there anything else a salesperson should do to build trust?
It does. Now, because on the manipulative side of the recruiting process, you would never want the prospective agent know that this is all basically in your self-interest or your country's self-interest that you're doing this. That would destroy everything on the front end. So I love that equation. I think that's really powerful.
And was there anything else you can add to for a salesperson listening about building trust? Is there any other things that you picked up about how you build trust with someone?
One thing that the CIA psychologist pounded me on a lot is the fact that consistency. So if you inadvertently break trust, and we've all heard this, but if you inadvertently break trust, you've done a huge amount of damage. Let me tell a quick story on myself. I'm not very proud of this, but it just shows you how easy it is for this to do this. So I'm walking through CIA headquarters, the old headquarters building. You've seen the big shield on the floor, the CIA, and I was crossing that with the stars on the wall. And I run into an employee of mine, Mark, who had worked for me 10 years before. And I said, Mark, I haven't seen you in ages. How have you been? And he just lit up. And he said, I'm doing great. He said, I've just got my coaching certificate at Georgetown University. And I said, great, Mark, because I know you were always interested in coaching, and I'm so happy for you. And he had this, leaned back and he had this perplexed look on his face. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, oh, I thought you hated coaching. And I said, why? And he said, I came to your office 10 years ago and told you, I said there were some opportunities to take coaching training. and I told you about it and you grimaced. Isn't that something? So I remember him coming in saying that.
10 years, Mike, 10 years.
10 years.
He remembered that.
He remembers that. And I was under pressure from my boss, who's a real detail-oriented person on timelines of doing this project. And Mark was in the part of the project that was farthest behind. So the only thing I can think of was I show my emotions through facial expressions. So I'm thinking to myself, oh God, if I let him go to training and do this extra thing, we're going to fall even farther behind. But again, it goes back to that social pain. Remember, it embeds stronger and more lasting than physical pain. So I know Mark is right because he would memories are fallible, but he remembered the grimace. And so it's just again, this thing on building trust. You really got to be careful and legitimate and authentic as you're going through this process of reciprocity and building and building and building that trust.
So just for also something that I picked up literally this week, which I hadn't really thought about, I was with a communications coach. I give quite a lot of keynotes. So I have a communications coach that helps me get 1% better every time I do it. And he said something really interesting, I thought, about facial expression, which talks to exactly what you've just mentioned. So as a salesperson, you're building trust. You have to be 100% authentic. If your face tells a different story to the words that are coming out of your mouth, you cannot fake it. It's not possible because the other person will see through it. So be really careful about what you say and how your face looks at the time that you say it.
Because it's these things we're unaware of, right? We're totally unaware of some of this. Let me pile on and add to what you just said, that 1% struck up. Another big thing, like in leadership training, leadership development, what we find, this is a hidden secret, is that we don't do well with people actually applying it in the workplace. So I've been working on that problem. What is it about leadership training so I finally centered on this problem of habit. And you mentioned, there was a book called Atomic Secrets, that Pink says recently, was saying, you can improve, but remember, we're captive to our brain, and you can improve, but do it 1% per day. And I think that is a beautiful message to tell anybody that's doing sales and wants to up their game and anywhere, to be open-minded, see where your weaknesses are, or see where can you push your strengths even more, especially important. And that 1% a day, it just means to keep on trying. This is what happens. I found this out with my psychologist when it's a miracle of the brain. But let's say you've done something for the first time, 3 times, 5 times, 10 times, whatever, it varies. Your brain says, wait a minute, why am I using the logical part of the brain and chewing up all this glucose? And somehow magically it writes a software packet that it throws into the automatic brain. So this is where it gets interesting. Now, let's say you've got your habit and you're unthinking, and most of our day, not most, but a large part of our day is habitual. You see, sitting in meetings and listening to people. But let's say you decide to change that habit. Our silly brain thinks, wait a minute, if this habit has been safe, I haven't died as a result of this. So now somebody wants to change it. I'd better warn them. And so it sends out an error message. It's a little tiny ping. Sometimes you notice it, sometimes you don't, but ooh. And it's simply a way to hold habit in place. And that's why it's so hard to break habit, is our brain, it's the crazy survival instinct rearing its head and saying, wait a minute, don't change this. But if you do this, if a salesperson would just look at 1% a day, I'm going to do this tomorrow, the next day I'm going to do this, and then use some kind of visual display, stick it on a calendar or on the to-do list to give them an added boost. I think that's the way you really get better and reach excellence at some point.
The fact that you've brought out that automatic brain, I think, is really important. Definitely.
Yeah.
And it's what again, the shortcut, I think, is we say, oh, we've got good instincts. What I think we're actually saying is the automatic brain is programmed to do things in a certain way, and we've forgotten why we do it in a certain way, but we know historically we get good results when we do it that way. It's automatic. Whereas someone new to the game doesn't know. So you learn from people, you look at their automatic habits, and then you pick up on those.
And I had one more thought, because you asked me a question a while back on kind of spying and sales and so forth. But one thing I discovered, this is interesting, the vision part of the brain, the occipital lobe and all that, takes up more space than all the other senses combined. It was about 3 months ago they did a study, and they discovered that if you see something and all of your other senses say no and the sight says yes, that almost all the time you'll go with sight. Isn't that interesting? So that's number one. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to that one. Number two is the brain is actually a story machine. So you and I see Juanita go up to a copier, and as we come up, she runs off, and you and I find the copier jammed. The brain wants certainty, back to the book, but the brain wants certainty. So I have to make up a story to explain this to my brain of what just happened. And so I make up the story of, well, Juanita is really a bad citizen. I mean, she's just selfish and she just bolted and fled the scene. You, being a nicer person, you say, oh, isn't she wonderful? She just ran off to get help. So the visualization part of the brain, it's called the predictive part of the brain, looking into the future. It does it, and it also explains things backward. But the predictive part is a vision machine. So when you put the visioning part of the brain together with the vision part, you got like China on the map of Asia in terms of topography, right? So what does that mean for messaging if you're in sales? Well, you would obviously, on the visual side, visually display data, for example. Show a graph. Don't go talking numbers, but, show a graph. Use pictures.
Use videos.
Absolutely. And just don't forget the importance of this vision part. And then now let's get to visioning. What does it mean you should do? Well, you should use metaphors, right? Analogies, pictures of the brain. You should tell stories. And this is crucial. Again, going back to the question you'd asked is, if I were in sales, I would certainly have stories that I could leash that are meaningful to that other person. And they could be self-deprecating, never be the hero of your own story, or it could be lessons learned that might be helpful. And obviously envy you to having your commo coach, because they would tell me to, shorten up those stories too and make them a little pithier. But all of this, think about visions and visioning and how you can use that to weave into getting that message across.
And being memorable is what that speaks to. As a salesperson, you want to be memorable so they come back to you. Mike, we could carry on for another half an hour quite happily, but we won't. We might come back, however, on another episode. So just pull together for me as a kind of final thought. If you draw all this together, what lessons learned do you have for any kind of sales leader, sales director looking to motivate a sales team and drive growth and hit their own targets? What have you learned through your lessons of looking at great leaders, being in the CIA? What is it about lessons learned for sales directors looking to motivate a sales team?
The way I look at the world, you've got administration, and then let's overlap that with management. There's another function, but then you've got leadership, right? And something I've recently discovered, we all have this, it's called a tangibility bias, which means we will tend to gravitate to managing and administration because that's hard stuff. And then we will tend to forget the soft stuff, the people stuff. And you see this where CEOs, instead of trying to work on culture, a people issue, they'll reorganize. Or you look at your own to-do list. Nowhere on your to-do list does it say, tell Mary that she did a super job on that last sales call. It's all administrative stuff. And because that's the tangibility bias. So one thing I would tell, you got to force yourself into the leadership column, and you can do it with just being introspective for about 20 minutes a week. And it could be Saturday morning with a cup of coffee or tea, and think through, okay, what am I going to do on the people side? Think about this. What praise would I give each employee? And what if I don't know? If I don't know what to praise Tom for, just ask him, Tom, what were you proudest of accomplishing this week? You'll be surprised, and then you can praise him for it. The second thing I would do, and this is so simple too, is make sure a lot of us will have these staff meetings once a week, or maybe, hopefully not daily, but sometimes that they're status check meetings, right? That one person says, well, today I did this and I'm calling these people. And the next person says, I'm calling these people, I'm doing this, and I did this yesterday. And those can be good occasionally, But the trouble is you're burning up a lot of other people's times that don't have an immediate interest in. So Adobe started something called check-ins. And a check-in is it's not a performance review. It's not a feedback session. All it is, it's got to be under 5 minutes. And it's just a brief one-on-one between the boss and let's say, the salesperson. And it is informal. The more formal it is, the less power you have getting into the brain. It's quite informal. And it literally is a check-in. Think of a sales manager going like a butterfly from one to the other, one to the other, one to the other. What it's doing, it's lowering all that angst that we have internally of, is the boss mad at me and all of that crazy stuff we've got going on. And the reason it works so well is in the group sessions, I have a big fear, which I call, I don't want to look foolish in front of my boss. And I think that's deep in all of us, but we don't admit it, but it's there. So we're not going to speak out. Now we're just got a little friendly session that's under 5 minutes, and we know it happens once a week. And the boss can say, are you stuck on anything? Is there anything I can help you with? And if you want, I can shoot you a list of really interesting questions. But what you would do, you open it up, it's a little chit-chat, how's Timmy's doing in soccer? Then you would ask this one question, and you start the dialogue. What you're doing, it's the difference between a rocket and a missile, where Jack Welch inherited a performance management system that GE developed, which was, we're going to tell you how you're doing once a year.
Right, yes.
You're talking about uncertainty, right? He recognized that. And so he said he abolished it my second year at GE. And it was like an anvil off my shoulders of worry. And he said, what I want the bosses to just talk to their employees more. And that's what the check-in is, just a way to force you to do that. And I'll send you some sheets on people can use to use this. It's great for sales managers. But all you're doing is you're doing a check-in, slight mid-course correction, and overtime. And isn't that better than waiting for a year to try to get the correction like this? And by the way, John Cleese, of course, you know who John Cleese is, tells a story, and I'll shoot this to you. His favorite nursery story, he claims, when he's 5 years old, is Gordon the Rocket, Gordon the Missile. And he says, okay, so Gordon the Missile is flying, and Gordon says, hey, how am I doing? Sends a message, and the ground says, hey, Gordon, you're off, turn left. So Gordon turns left, and it keeps going. He's going through this thing. Gordon's calling back. Okay, Gordon, you're go foot down and turn this way. And he just keeps going through the story, and then finally Gordon hits the target. And so at the end of the story, he says, and then Mr. Criticism stands up and says, look how many mistakes that Gordon made during that process.
Yeah.
And then he sits back and he says, but it doesn't matter. He hit the target. And so if you're a sales manager, think about that. Check-ins every week, and you're learning much more than you otherwise would in meetings, I promise you. So I'll send some stuff for it that you can post.
Mike, it's been amazing. Thanks ever so much for joining me on Higgle, the B2B Sales Club podcast. Where can people find out more about you?
MikeMears.com, and I can shoot you some links on that as well. So the book, to be a little pushy, is called Certainty, but I've got huge amounts of free stuff that I give out on that MikeMears.com site people can download. And thank you. You've taught me a lot thinking about sales, and
It's been a pleasure. It's made both our brains think in different ways, which is always a good thing. Mike, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for listening to Higgle, the B2B Sales Club podcast series with your host, Mike Lander. Please subscribe so that you'll catch all the next episodes.